if you look at the stats, about in the 1950s, about 1% of the adult population had type 2 diabetes. Now that number is over 13%. And if you look at the combination of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, that number is 50% of American adults. This is all happening in the last, 50 to 75 years. So what are the factors that are leading to this? It is many. Okay. And I think there's two ways to look at it. I think you can look at it on like the actual, what are the pillars in our life that are contributing to this? So I think that's worth talking about. And then what are the systems issues that are contributing to this? Because those are both important. So on the first side, it's like what elements of our modern our recent environments are contributing to this, because obviously not genetic. It's happening over the past 50 to 75 years. And I think it really falls into like about 7 or 8 categories. Of course, genetics being one of them, but really our environment amplifying this genetic predisposition. So when you look at the lifestyle and environmental factors, where of course food is the biggest one, right? We have an ultra processed food environment where we're eating the majority of our calories from these food-like industrial substances that completely put our biology through a tailspin and create metabolic dysfunction. And that's the majority of our calories now. So 60% for adults, 68% for kids of our calories are coming from ultra processed, industrially manufactured foods that our bodies basically for millions of years never evolved to see, and that essentially become this overwhelming nutrient source that stresses our cells, stresses our mitochondria, causes oxidative stress and mitochondrial damage, creates metabolic dysfunction in our cells, and is a threat signal to the body, which generates chronic inflammation, which of course is intimately tied to metabolic dysfunction. So you've got the ultra processed food supply. That is number one. Not to mention in that industrially processed, conventionally farmed food, you've got pesticides sprayed all over it. So you've got this like ultra processed food covered in poisons, which we know hurt our microbiome, which is super related to metabolic health. And it's super processed, so we absorb it super quickly. So it really overloads our body. And on top of that, it's grown in this conventional agriculture system that's very unnatural, which reduces micronutrient composition. So we have limited micronutrients, more high concentration of these macronutrients like sugar and carbohydrates, and it's covered in poison. So that's a trifecta that is number one. And of course, we're gavaging our children with this in their school lunches because the FDA and the USDA are super in cahoots with lots of industries, processed food industry that want that food in front of kids. So that's kind of number one is food. And then I won't go into as much detail as some of the other pillars, but we're sleeping way less than we were 100 years ago. We're super skimping on sleep. Sleep is our ultimate recovery tool for metabolic health, and we're just not sleeping enough, and our sleep is interrupted because of our phones and our beeping and our blue light everywhere. So we've got food, we've got sleep, we've got chronic low-grade stress. People are more anxious and more stressed than ever. We obviously have a mental health crisis in the United States. People are living in fear. That puts our body in a fear state, a threat state. That's going to, of course, hurt our metabolic health because if your body's focused on stress and fear, it's not going to be focused on thriving and metabolic health. So sleep, food, stress, sedentary behavior. We're sitting the vast majority of our time. We are not getting outside and moving. Many people are spending less than 2 hours of the day up from a chair. I mean, this is absolutely unprecedented evolutionarily. Hunter-gatherers, they predict, walked over 20,000 steps a day. Many Americans are walking an average of 3,800 steps a day. It's absolutely catastrophic because our muscles are one of our key metabolic organs. They soak up glucose. They produce anti-inflammatory cytokines. We're just not using them. And of course, we've told women not to resistance train because they're going to bulk up. And so we have people who are under muscled, as Dr. Gabrielle Lyons said, and this is a huge root cause of obesity. So we're sedentary. We're not lifting things. So food, sleep, exercise, stress. And then there's some other factors like that are a little bit more nuanced, but actually, as I've dug into the research, are quite important. So one is actually a concept I call thermoneutrality. So we live in these environments where we're just always at like 72 degrees. We just like sit here and we just want to be comfortable. And we like never, if it's like 73 or 68, people are like, oh my God, I need a sweater. Thermoneutrality is actually not normal. If you think about historically, like this whole idea of being indoors is a relatively modern phenomenon. Like we were not living indoors with all this climate control, 100, 200 years ago. We didn't have heaters and air conditioning. So we were experiencing bigger swings in temperature. And if you think about cold, your body is so brilliant. If you are cold, it's actually a stimulus to the body to generate heat. How do we generate heat? We rev up our mitochondria to make more heat. And using your mitochondria is metabolic function. That is what's going to lead you towards metabolic health. We're just basically not stimulating our mitochondria enough with exercise and with cold. And so by never exposing our bodies to extreme temperatures, we're actually making them really kind of metabolically complacent. So we want to get ourselves out of that thermoneutral lifestyle we're in. And this is, of course, why like cold plunges and saunas are becoming so hot right now. But if you kind of like take away the biohacking sheen of all of that, it's really just like going back to how our bodies really evolve, which is to experience big swings in temperature. And then the two last ones I would just mention is light. So this is another kind of nuanced one that's a little bit, odder, I think. But like the fact that we're exposed to blue light all throughout the day, basically 24 hours a day, because of the artificial lights that we now have in our screens and our light bulbs. This is actually very bad for metabolic health as well, because so much of our metabolic processes are set up on 24-hour circadian clocks. And the way that we entrain our body to truly know what time it is through light exposure. So like we've got these little optic nerves in the back of our eyes, and these are these sort of like magical conduits that basically convey information from the sun to your brain. Like the inside of the body is dark, right? It does not really know what time it is. It needs photons to hit that optic nerve and send a signal to your brain, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, to say, hey, it's morning. Hey, it's night. This is what genetic pathways and what hormones you need to release. And right now it's daylight all the time to our brains because we're constantly seeing this blue light. So can you imagine how confusing that is to our bodies and to our metabolic pathways that are like, wait a minute, it's 8 a.m. all the time, and then on top of that, we don't go outside at all anymore, right? We're inside all the time. And the stats on this are crazy. There are kids who are spending less than an hour outside a day in a 24-hour period. We should be spending most of the time outside because that is basically a signal to our body of what time it is. So we're basically indoors during the day when we should be getting that high-powered photon signal from the sun during the day. And then at night, when we're supposed to really be getting very little light energy into the brain, we're blasting our eyes with blue light from our screen. So we're totally flip-flopped, metabolic mayhem, really confusing. And the last one I'll mention in terms of our obesogenic environment of the modern world is toxins. We have like 80,000 or more synthetic toxins made in factories that have been introduced into our air, water, food, furniture, personal care products, homes, electronics over the past 150 years. Most of which have not been tested for safety, and they have certainly not been tested for safety together. If they're tested for safety, they're tested in isolation. So you've got 80,000 chemicals, and many of them are what we call obesogens. They're known obesogens, meaning that the chemical molecular structure of that toxin that are being added to all sorts of products can actually disrupt key metabolic pathways, whether that is microbiome composition that's associated with metabolic health, whether that's directly impairing our mitochondrial function, whether that's changing the epigenetics, so like the folding of our genome in a way that impacts metabolic health. So this concept of obesogenic chemicals is being understood now. And so many of the chemicals that we're basically just swimming in now, not in our control, are causing, like not just associated with, but causative of obesity and metabolic dysfunction. So we just ran through a lot, but that's basically food, sleep, exercise, stress, light, temperature, toxins. That is our obesogenic environment that if you are just born into the United States right now, you are being born into that world. And in some ways, it almost feels like to prevent the nearly inevitable metabolic dysfunction that you are going to get as a modern American and almost inevitable overweight or obesity, because that's 74% of the country, 93% metabolic dysfunction, 74% obesity or overweight. It's literally almost becoming inevitable if you are born into this country that you are going to have one of these issues. It's almost like you're spending your life just protecting yourself from modern culture. And I think that's why people kind of get obsessed with wellness and biohacking and all this stuff, because it almost can feel like if I'm not hyper vigilant, then I'm going to have a problem. And if I just go along with normal culture, I'm almost guaranteed to be screwed.